2003 was a really big year for aviation. It was the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, and everybody was doing programming. History Channel, Discovery Channel, at the time Discovery Wings, Speed, ESPN, and I was doing a lot of onboard camera work for all those people. So it was a busy year, and I remember specifically when I was doing car racing for the Hooters Pro Cup. A lot of that's in North Carolina, and I had one weekend where the car race was, I think, on a Friday night, and I took the time to drive over to Kitty Hawk because I knew we were going to be working at Kitty Hawk later on in the year. So I took a drive over to Kitty Hawk, and I wanted to see what it was like, and spend some time there, and talk to one of the docents at the museum, and it was interesting. We had a great conversation. I told him I was coming back to work on the TV crew in December. And he goes, yeah, he says, there's been a whole lot of ramp up and all kinds of things going on. He said, they're building that airplane and they've got $1 million invested in that airplane, which he was right. They were building an exact replica of the Wright Flyer. And he said, if they don't have just the right weather conditions, the right wind and the right direction, he said, that thing's never going to fly. He said the Wright brothers needed 22 miles an hour winds sustained to get that thing off the ground, and they did. And that day in December in 1903, it worked. And they flew, as you'll recall, very short distance. But they did fly in the first controlled flight. But that old docent, and those words rang clearly in my ear. I remembered that. So now we fast forward to December, and I'm there working with Discovery Channel, and we're wiring up the Wright Flyer, and I was working with the guys that had done that. Now, this airplane is incredibly fragile, and again, it had been over $1 million invested in this airplane. They basically took the original Wright Flyer, and when they were refurbishing it at the Smithsonian, they took it down from where it hangs and took it all apart. And these guys went in and made exact tracings and duplicates of all the pieces and built their Wright Flyer off of that. So it was about as exact as it could be. And it's a very delicate airplane. There's, cables and wires and everything running around. And I'm a big guy. And trying to figure out where to run the cables and do all that stuff. All I had was visions of me tripping and falling through the wing of the Wright Flyer. And the headline was, Baby Huey trips and falls and crushes Wright Flyer day before reenactment. But it took me 3 days to do what normally takes me an hour and a half. One of the things about our camera cables, they were gray. And to blend in, it's all spruce, and it's not stained very much. It's just, clear varnish. So it had a slight yellow tint to all the wood. And the only way I was able to figure out how to match my camera cables to that was to wrap them in masking tape and then stain them to match. So we did that. We had two 12-foot camera cables that we wrapped and got them all done. And, routed them, and had one camera looking over their shoulder and one on the cabane looking back, which gave you a great view of the pilot. And the recorder and the power supply and everything was put into a black pouch that sat just next to the pilot, because remember, they laid down. They were prone position and worked the controls on this aircraft, and they, to steer it, they pulled cables which flexed the wings, and the wings actually bent, and that's how they would turn. But his throttle controls and everything were right there. So we hid the camera controls right there. We get to the day of the flight, and it's a dreary, rainy day. And they had plowed up this 500-foot circle where they were going to set the airplane and start it. And they had the track, because if you will recall, the airplane was actually on a track, and they had a counterweight which hung to a cable, which helped the aircraft get up to speed to launch it. And all that was set up based on the direction of the wind. So they kind of waited to see what the prevailing winds were going to be. And like I say, weather sucked. They were trying to do it the exact minute and hour to the original, but they couldn't do it. That came and passed, and it was muddy and windy. And, we're all standing by out there because, again, I got tape in there. And I don't want to start the tape roll until the last possible minute. The president was there and all kinds of dignitaries. And the deadline kind of came and went. President hung around as long as he could. He ultimately had to leave. And later on that day, the weather cleared up enough that we had to go. So we're all getting in the sacred circle, I call it, because there was only just the pilots and a few other people inside that circle. And one of the guys that had taught the two pilots that were going to, play a Wilbur and Orville was a guy by the name of Scott Crossfield, who flew the X-15, famous test pilot, just an incredible guy. Well, he had trained them on flying this thing. And I got the thumbs up to get in there and start the cameras. And then the pilot, they flipped the coin, and the pilot that won the flip got prone in the aircraft. And I walked back and stood behind it, and I'm standing behind Scott Crossfield. And he's got the only piece of non-current equipment there. He's holding a digital anemometer, a wind gauge, and he's holding up in his hand. And I can see the readouts. And it's like 10.5 miles, 14 miles, 9 miles. It's bouncing all over the place. And in my head, I remember that old docent going, if they don't get 22 miles, it ain't going to fly. And they kept going, and it's bouncing around. Finally, it gets up to around 18, 19 miles. And they had all decided that they could fly at 15 miles if it was sustained. So it hovers around there for a while. I'm looking at the digital readout, and it stayed stable. And Scott Crossfield goes over and gives them the high sign. Boom. He cranks the throttles up. They drop the counterbalance. The plane starts to roll, and you could feel the wind die in our face. But the plane's committed. It's rolling, and there's no taking it back. And a couple 100,000 people are standing around watching as it rolls down the track. And it got just barely enough speed to kind of lift off. And my camera looking at the cabane, from the cabane strut, looking back. And my camera mounted on the cabane strut, looking back, has a great view of the pilot. And you can see all these emotions. The elation is it's going to fly. And then the trepidation, well, it's not going to. And finally the plane slows down and settles and leans over into the wind. And you could just see the disappointment in his face, and he leans over and chops the throttle and drops his head. And that was it. That airplane never flew again. It ended up being at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. To this day, it's on display there. Probably one of the highlights of my professional career. I got a call from the director of Discovery Programming that night, and he said, "Mark, your 2 onboard videos told the whole story." He said, "Without those camera views, we could not have told this story the same way." And that was pretty cool. So again, December 2003, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So a sidebar to that, there's always a sidebar. There's always something else cool that happens. As we're waiting around that day, I think I told you the president just couldn't wait any longer. And he had a couple helicopters there to take him. So he left, helicopters took off, and he was at the Naval Air Station, which is only about 40, 50 miles north of there, is where where Air Force One was. And we're all standing around, and the ceiling is real low. In fact, it was so low you couldn't see the top of the Wright monument, which is roughly 300 foot tall. It was that low. And we're just, hanging around, and you hear the announcer goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, from the left, Air Force One." And down out of that low ceiling drops Air Force One. He does a low-level pass at maybe 200 feet. That was probably the coolest part of that whole day.